Mm-hmm. I don't need it.
Can't find it, but I forgot to look, there's one lady forgot to look in more places to ask.
Okay.
I'll just play mind games, game with myself.
All right. Well, we're live now. No problem. No worries. All right. Good evening, everyone. We're ready to get started in our class tonight. We hope that you're getting settled in for a good Bible study. Aline and Terrell are with us. I misplaced. All right. Last week we were looking at David again, the second time that he spared Saul. And we're going to continue this saga. This is a very interesting time when we take a look at David's life and compare all the things that he goes through and the preparation that it provides for him and getting him ready for him to be a king, watching him come out as a young shepherd boy and coming into the king's house, and then all the things that happened to him while he's going through serving the king, turning around and being a fugitive and running all across the area, the desert and such. And it's quite an interesting part of his life. Tonight I have a lot of information that we're going to try to cover. So I've got a couple of places I set in case we need to break and stop so we don't go over too far. So like I said, last week we looked at Saul once again having his life spared by David. The Ziphites had given him up again when he had moved away after the story with Abigail and Nabal. And so he moves back up moves back north, and when he gets up there, then Saul finds out. He comes down with 3,000 soldiers and once again is pursuing David. David finds out that he's in the area, so he creeps into the camp at night, and then he has to hold back the guy that snuck in there with him, and because he wants to go ahead and kill the king. And every time we see this, it's kind of an interesting point of wondering, what would you do if you were in that situation, if you were to have to be pursued the way he was pursued, knowing that you had been anointed by God and that you were going to be king, and yet the one king who is very ungodly, he is the one that is trying to kill you. So everyone's suffering also because of Saul. Saul is an unrighteous man, a very selfish man. He is the one that is suffering the consequences of his own lack of spirituality, and now he's being punished. So when we think about this man and his guilt and his consequence of his own sin, then attacking and going after David, we see the point where he brings him in, he loves him, he takes care of him, brings him, make him a part of his family, and then the spirit within him starts to turn. Eventually he does realize that David is going to be the next king. In trying to protect and usurp what God has already foretold, he fights God. And that's something that I think is important for us to learn, is to realize that many times the consequences of our sin is something that we have to live with. And instead of rebelling and fighting against God, we should repent. We should turn around, something we never see Saul do, except for these little moments where his life is about to end. And then David's righteous attitude and, oh, David, you're just, you're God's child, and please forgive me. And he calls him son, and then he goes away. But it doesn't last. We see that it's hypocrisy. But both of these times where he spares David, I thought was very amazing, is the way that what he says publicly is prophetic. It's something that's telling everyone around him, those people that Saul has stirred up himself to be against David, because what's the charge, that he's brought up against him? He's treasonous and he needs to be killed because he's a traitor to Israel. And then in that moment, with all the men that he's stirred up, that they're, charging out there with him to go and attack and to kill David, he admits it. His own commander, Abner, he says it out loud that, David, you are the chosen one. You are going to rule. I now know this. But then it doesn't last, again and again. So after he spares his life and he repents, he heads back up and departs from the area. Now, David is learning quickly that not to trust David. Every time that he has had these engagements with Saul, he moves. And as he moves, we see that, he is then pursued again. What's that? Oh, well, that's a problem because I have to go. Okay, so I forgot to turn something on. I wish I could say that's the worst that I've ever had, the technical problem I've had to deal with. But thank you for reminding me. Give it a little chance to catch up. So you guys that are online, go ahead and make some comments. See what you think about so far the story, what we've been dealing with Saul and David being on the run. We'll get this. Shouldn't take much more. Yeah, we'll get it. Yeah. It's kind of hard. You realize you got people you're teaching to in the building, and for the year of COVID, I had nobody here. It was me and that little thing mounted to the wall back there. So, okay, there we go. Sorry for the delay, but so he does, what I think is interesting is he goes back to the Philistines. Do you remember the first time? What was his first time when he went to the Philistines? What was that? The very first time that he left the country and he fled to the Philistines, do you remember what occurred there? And that time he went by himself. The difference now is he has 600 men. He's got a small army with him. Plus he's coming with a reputation. The last time that he went, he acted like he was a crazy man. There's some reason that he thought maybe he could hide in the land of the Philistines and no one would know who he is. But yet this is the man who killed Goliath, the Philistine. This is the man who they sang songs about, that he killed David, killed thousands. And we know that he is known by the Philistines. But yet he goes there the first time and he acts crazy. And the king kind of blows it off and goes, don't I have enough mad people around this place anyway? And just blows him off. And David hightails. It's like, okay. And so, but this is another time he goes to the Philistines. I always find it hard whenever you see a man of his caliber spirituality that has to leave his own people and seek refuge among very ungodly people. The Philistines are not good people. Let's remember that. They never were. They were a group of people they called a sea people from the Aegean Sea, and they came in, and the Egyptians actually have some history with them as well. But the Philistines are one group of what historians call the sea people, and they were very vicious. They were very warlike. They had the capabilities of defeating anyone. They conquered Egypt. They actually inflicted a lot of damage to them. They were extremely brutal when it come to the way that they would handle their enemies and everything. So This time, though, it's a little different. And he's coming now with 600 men. So depending if you're a Philistine king, how would you deal with him? He's dangerous. He's a variable. He's something that if I was king, I'm sure he was aware. Because remember, he was in the cave of Adullam, and he heard that the Philistines were coming up and attacking and taking away from the threshing floor and taking all the goods away from the people at Keelah. He inquires of God, and God says, yes, go. Go and protect them. And he goes out and he attacks the Philistines. So any good king also has good intelligence. They're aware of what's going on in the countries around them. So I have no doubt that the king of the Philistines is very aware of the situation with David and Saul. And so now you have this man coming to you with these soldiers, and they're all warriors themselves and wanting to stay in your territory. So let's go ahead and read the first verse. It starts us out in 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 11. But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So what does he see? He sees that no matter where I go in Israel, I'm going to continue to be pursued. Now, before the situation with Nabal and Abigail, he was very reliant upon the people in the area to feed him. And one of the things that we see him doing was providing kind of security. He would protect people, which is kind of sick and sad because Saul should have been doing this. The king, their king, should have been taking care of people, and it was David that was doing this. And that's why I was saying that if he would have killed Saul any one of those 2 times, I don't think there'd been a tear shed for Saul at all. I think that the oppressive taxes and the things that we see that he was doing and his attitude and his temper, that if David would have killed him, no one would have said a word. They would have been, we don't miss him. We're not going to miss him. And especially because everybody knew David was to be the king. God had said, this guy's going to be king. David's going to be the king. But we see Saul restraining. And one of the big messages I want us to remember is he always let the vengeance be in the Lord's hands. And that's something that's difficult for us. No matter how much of an opportunity you have to maybe get even justly, I mean, I would say, in David's situation, it's kill or be killed. I attack and I kill the king, or I'm going to be killed. I'm anointed. I could see him justifying it, saying, you know what, I have just as much a right, and if this guy's going to come at me, man, I'm going to go. And David is a warrior. Never forget this. And you're going to read something tonight. I hope it shocks you about David, that you're going to learn about him, that he was as ruthless a warrior you would ever see. And yes, he has this amazing part where we read the Psalms and we go, oh man, David, you know how to write them. You are so connected to God. And then we see this part of him that you understand when God said, no, David, you're not going to build my house. You're a man with blood on your hands. A man that God also says, he's a man after my heart. So he's a complex person at the same time. He's not perfect. And I want us to also remember that there's never a time where we know of where God was talking directly to David. What God wanted, David utilized the priest to communicate with God. He would use the prophets to find out about God, what God wanted, but nothing outside of normal where God said, David, it's time for us to talk. Okay, now I don't want you to kill the king, and sit and tell him and guide him and direct him. In many ways, it's just like us. There's a lot of times if we think about it that we need to go to God's word. That's where we need to go and look for the guidance. And this is what we find David doing. Now, he didn't have a Bible, but he had people that had access, that were receiving information from God and were speaking for God, the prophets. And that's what he utilized. But he's still a man. He's still, just like all of us, where he has his doubts. He has his fears. And he's got a lot of people he's got to take care of. Now, also remember that when the Hebrews would number people, they would count them by the males. So when we read here that he had 600 men, you need to also calculate that that's counting the families and wives and others that were with them. And men that weren't counted, a lot of, I don't know if they were doing it this far back, but really a man wasn't considered a man until he was 30. So it's not just 600 people that he is responsible for, that he is leading. And it's a very challenging, very burdensome as well. We just skim through and look at these passages and forget about the weight of leadership that he has. And for him to be able to maintain that spiritual attitude towards taking vengeance on himself, for himself, against his enemy, and teaching his men, and telling and holding back warriors who are just as threatened as he is. Remember, it's not just his life that's at stake here. Saul would murder them all. And he would probably, and we know he had no qualms with killing their wives and their children. So when you tell me as a leader, don't kill that main threat to you, myself, and my family, you better be a good leader. I better have a lot of faith in you as a leader. And he was able to do that. So that's another part of him that is just amazing, that you can see these things where God saw this beautiful heart, not a perfect person, but a person who was honestly trying to do it. And so he knows Saul is gutless. There's a part about Saul, he's a coward. I mean, he'll let everybody else do his dirty work. And so he knows that if I can get outside the boundaries, he's not going to come into the land of the Philistines and try to find me there. But is it the best option? I thought about this. I mean, going to the Philistines, doesn't that not risk more compromise spiritually? Going out among the most ungodly group of people and seeking security from there, than having that trust in God and saying, it's okay, we'll just keep, running around. God's delivered me so far. He hasn't caught me yet. And now I have these riches from Nabal, who, if you'll recall, remember, he goes one moment, where David spares Saul. He's very compassionate in all this. And then all of a sudden he turns around and Nabal says, no, I'm not going to share my goods with you. And he goes into a fit of rage, gathers up all his men. He's going to go kill and wipe out everybody in Nabal's house. And it's Abigail who intercedes. So we see a flip there as well. This same guy who has this ability to be spiritual. Who's Nabal? Well, Abigail reminds him, says his name is what he is. He's a fool. His name means he's a fool. And it took somebody to intercede, to stop him. It wasn't God whispering in his ear saying, now, David, you're making a mistake. You need to stop. So this decision, I think, going to the land of the Philistines, I just kind of wonder, how much faith do you have? Why didn't you? That's God's people. You were doing a good thing, staying there for the Hebrews. And now you've gone off into this land and you're going to then deceive and be deceptive, or you're going to compromise yourself. You're either going to lie to somebody. You're going to deceive the king and say, I'm with you. I'm going to do whatever you want. I'm going to submit to you, or you're going to lie. And he wouldn't even be in that position if he just stayed in the territory of Israel and allowed God to continue to protect him. So I see it as kind of a little bit of a stressful decision that he made. But the way he's able to work it out is amazing. He walks a fine line. He really does when it comes down to this. So David, in 2 through 42, this is a large text. We're going to break this down some. So David and his departed. They went over to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. David and his men settled with Gath and Achish. Each man had his family with him. See, there's the number. Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched. That's where I say I think he's a coward. If he really wants to protect his dynasty and protect his kingdom for himself, he would do whatever he could to take him out. Send an assassin. You know, he knows he's weak. That's the other part about the Philistines that we need to remember is the Philistines technologically were way advanced when it comes to the Israelites. They had chariots, this thing called chariots. That's like today saying you have an army that's on foot, infantry, David, versus a country that had tanks. Huge difference. So they had chariots. They had a much better armament than what the Israelites had. So he goes over there, takes everyone over, and and then we see that it says that Saul stopped searching for him. So this is a map. I love maps. If you haven't figured that out by now, I love maps to try to give us an idea of the area there. If we start out at En-Gedi, is the cave that Saul had come in up against the Dead Sea. He flees down to Maon. This is where Baal happened. And then he slides up here to Ziph. And at Ziph is where the second time occurs, where he slides into the camp and he's able to get out. And Saul repents again. After that, then he decides, look, I got to get out of the country. And so then he takes off and goes up to Gath. Now, the Philistines were not a nation state. When I say a nation state, it's kind of unique because a nation state is a state of accumulation of cities, a conglomerate of larger areas. And what you have back then is what we call city states. So the rulers were in the cities versus a nation state is where you had one ruler over multiple cities. But at this time, the Philistines, they're really a conglomerate of 5 cities and some suburbs and smaller areas. But they still were a little bit divided. That kind of makes you a little bit weak when you look at that. So he slides over to Gath. Let's go ahead and read on. So David meets with the king. And then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the countries. Live there. Why should your servant live in a royal city with you? So on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings. David lived in Philistine territory a year and 4 months. So David, I think it's wise, because if he's under the same city, he's going to be under the thumb of the king, and the king's going to be able to watch everything he does. And he's going to, if he disobeys or is, I guess you'd say, real easy to find out. Now, Ziklag is not, we don't really know exactly the location other than the fact that it was south of Gath. There's a couple of modern day cities in Israel in that area that they believe identified those up there where he moved down. So now you notice he's further south and he's quite a distance away, so he can't be watched as much. While he's down in Ziklag that's been given to him, now David and his men went up and they raided the Geshurites, Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people had lived on the land extending from attacked an area. He did not leave a man or a woman alive, but he took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothing. Then he returned to Achish. So he goes out and he raids these lower tribes, these tribes that are not Hebrew. If you'll remember, there's a lot of different genealogies going on here, and we won't go through every one of them. But if you'll remember, the Amalekites, this was one of the first great transgressions that Saul had, was when he was given the instructions by Samuel to go completely annihilate them. And he tells them that it's because of their actions, the way they treated the children of Israel when they were coming up out of the land of Egypt, and they were very vulnerable. And the way that they were vulnerable was the people that were weak and slow, they were lagging behind. And so the Amalekites would take advantage of that. They would sneak up and attack and kill and raid the weaker people that were in the back of this long procession of the Israelites as they were leaving. So God had said, he told Moses, he said, Moses, when you get into the land and you settle and you conquer the land, I want you to then tell Caleb to go down and to punish and to destroy and attack the Amalekites. 300 years go by. And then he gives the instructions to then have Saul fulfill that promise. And he doesn't do it. And that's the first one where God says, you're going to lose your kingdom. You have failed. And I'm sure that there's a whole lot more because God knew his heart, but this was a very overt disobedient act that he had. He's raised, I don't know if you noticed, but one of the important verses in here is where it says that whenever he attacked an area, he did not leave a man, a woman alive. Why would he do that? Kind of wait, see if we can get some interaction here. Because that's one of the things that we always get accused of when we talk about the Old Testament is a lot of times we see that this God of the Old Testament is a bloody God. Haven't you heard that? Always talking about how God is some, God of blood, a God of war. And then the New Testament God, it's all love. Oh boy, he just, it's all hugs and grace and all this. But then why were these things going on? And then all of a sudden David, it seems like, well, we know what his motive is so that no one would be able to tell the truth. Because if anybody survived and they were able to get all the way back, if you look at that map again, the cities in which he was raiding were quite a distance away from Gath up here where Achish is at, the king. So if he can take out any, he's going to be able to go up. And in just reading that, it's kind of hard to take. It's like, well, why are you so cruel and brutal? Let's go back to the Amalekites. That was something that they were supposed to have taken care of. And every one of these tribes, if you go back and you were to look, it's not that God is randomly doing this. It's not that God is necessarily approving it, but I can see where there's a part of a judgment that is being carried out on these people for their unrighteousness, their ungodliness as well. But David as well is using this for the fact that if he was to be found out, then he is still loyal. He's showing his loyalty while he's under the protection of the Philistines. So let's go ahead and read some more. When Achish asked, where did you go raiding today? David would say, against Negev of Judah, Negev of Jerahmeel, or against Negev the Kenites. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, this is what David did. And such was his practice as long as he lived in the Philistine territory. Achish trusted David, and he said to himself, he has become that he will be my servant for life. So he asked him, well, so what have you been doing? Because now, one thing that's not really being expressed real clearly here is why would he even go back up to Gath? And it's because he's paying tribute. He's taking a portion of what he is taking, and he's going back up to appease Achish and let him have some of the bounty that he is accumulating. So he says, what are you doing? And he lies. He flat out says, well, basically, he's being generic, but he's insinuating that he's attacking the Israelites. And as far as the Canaanites, as well. So that's why we see that he did not want anyone to come up and to testify basically that, no, we're not Hebrews. No, this is what he's doing down there. And it says that was his practice the entire time, a year and a half that he was down there. Now, let's talk about how old David is. Now, we don't know, we don't really have precisely how old he was at each of these historical events, but it's estimated that from the time that he killed Goliath, he was possibly 20 or so. He was still not old enough necessarily, and this is a presumption in a way, but serving in the military, he was the one left back. He was watching the sheep. So that's kind of the historical time start of looking at an approximate age of David. And so by the time we know that he starts to rule, he's not going to start to rule till he's 30. We're getting real close to when he's going to start to rule. And this event, we're coming up real quick, but we know a year and a half has gone by. So he's still not 30. So he's probably 28, 29. Now think about that for a moment, all the responsibility that he's been carrying with these people and the spiritual decisions that he's made. I mean, this is another thing that when you see young men today, when you find someone like this, it really is beautiful. It's wonderful to see this in a young man that can have this. So he's still pretty young. Now, the Achish figures, oh, wow, he's on my side, so he's actually going to become repulsive to the Israelites. Even though he's been anointed king, because he's attacking the Israelites, then they're going to reject him. And so that's why he says, now I've got him. I've got him. And they're going to never trust him at all. So the next part is now the Philistines. Now, if you'll recall all the way back to the time when David and Goliath, there was a major battle going on between the Philistines and the Israelites, and that's when Goliath was slain. And in their fleeing, they were overrun by the Israelites and attacked them, and they repulsed them out. Because what's going on, and I have a map, we'll look at this, is that the Philistines are swinging around the coast by the Mediterranean Sea. Because if you look geographically in the terrain, the mountain country is not a good place for chariots. So it's just like a tank. You don't go up into the mountains and try to do combat. So they took advantage of what they had in their strength, and that was the chariots. So they would try to take the level and the open plains and try to attack. So what they're doing is they're trying to really, you're going to see where they're trying to divide the tribes from the north and the south up towards Manassas. So as they assembled together, starting in chapter 28 of 1 Samuel, verse 1, in those days the Philistines gathered. And that's an indication as well of the city-state. When it says gathering, what's happening is they're all getting together and agreeing, all these cities, okay, let's go again, against Israel. Achish said to David, you must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army. And David said, then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. Achish replied, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. So here's a little trivia question. Who else was he a bodyguard for? He was Saul's bodyguard. And that was one of the things that Ahimelech, the high priest, said when he was standing before Saul, when Saul drug him down and had him before him and said, why are you supporting this traitor? And Ahimelech goes, well, what are you talking about? He's married to your daughter. He's in charge of your bodyguard. So he was in a very trusted place with Saul. And now the Philistine king is saying basically, you don't just let anybody protect you. Now I want you to think about the other Philistines and the other commanders. As they're watching these conversations, I don't think for a minute those other commanders really had a whole lot of trust in David. And so they gathered together the cities, and like I said, they're ready to make another push, and they're going to go forward. Now, the statement that Achish says to David is, you understand, you get that you're going to have to come up, and you're going to have to really prove yourself and fight against them. Now, before David was able to say, yeah, I'm down south, I'm way down there, and we're doing it, and here's the goats, here's the camels, and look, here you go. Here's your tribute. But now he's going to have to take action. He's going to have to do something. I love what David said, because it's not total. It depends on how you listen to this. Now, if you're the Philistine king, this is a great answer. If you're David, if David wouldn't kill Saul in 2 opportunities he had in a cave, and he kept proclaiming, Saul is the anointed, until God does it. And he even said the last time, he said, if God takes him out, he dies or he gets killed. It was almost prophetic. He said, even if he falls in battle, that's the Lord's deal. I'm not going to do this. So remembering that, this statement takes a little bit different form to me. Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. I don't think for one moment David was going to turn and attack Saul. I think if anything, he would have spared him again. Him again. But think about the stress that David's under. Also remember, Every time that David leaves and goes on these raids, and when he departs and goes on this war party, where are all the families? They're left behind. They're vulnerable. And that's going to come back. And I think it's something providential, but kind of pulls him out of this. And so let's go ahead and read on now. And now Samuel was dead, and all of Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and the spiritists from the land. The Philistines were assembled, and they came and they set up camp near Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set up camp at Gilboa. The Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Find me a woman who is a medium, so that I may inquire of her. He can't, God's not talking to him, huh? And it also points out again him being a coward. He looks out, and he has every reason, honestly, to be afraid. When you don't have God on your side, it's a fearful thing. And people who have never had God on their side, they don't know how blessed it is to have him on your side. And again, just like David and many other times we see when God's working with those that are righteous, it's not that he's sitting there talking to them in the voice. It's something that they know because they're talking to God. And the way they talk to God was, again, through the prophets. And remember, David has a priest, a legitimate priest with him. And so he can inquire of the Lord and find out. And he's done that when he was making the decision to come out of the cave of Adullam and attack and repulse the Philistines. He inquired of the Lord. So that was told to us historically. So I think we would understand that David was constantly inquiring of the Lord. And even when his own men pushed back and said, look, we're not going to come out of this cave. It's not safe. And he goes back and he inquires again of the Lord. So Saul has no contact. But one of the things that we find that he did right was he got rid of all the mediums and spiritualists and all this from the land. And so what were they? Yes, Dorothy, you're right. I'm sorry, I'm not paying quite enough attention to my chat there. It was Saul that he was a bodyguard with. So what was the consequences of a medium and spiritualist to live in the land of Israel? Did the law say anything about it? Well, it was very specific. It addressed it very specific. The spiritualists and mediums, anybody who spoke to the dead, did seances or anything, were to be put to death. So it's kind of ironic. He can't find anybody. God's not talking to him. So he is going to utilize the thing that the law condemns by death if somebody is using. And there's none in the land. So he's wanting to find somebody. And so he, when he sees them, we see his heart was filled with terror. And he has no way of speaking to God. And so he says, find me a woman. And they find him one. And so reading on, there is one in Endor, they said. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went, consult a spirit for me. He said, bring up for me the one I name. But the woman said to him, surely you know what has done. See, not only repulsed him, forbid it, but by consequence of death, he has cut off the medium and the spiritualist from the land. A trap for my life to bring about my death. And Saul swore to her by the Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished. This is somebody invoking God and making a decision for God and saying, no, the Lord's not going to punish you. And, again, kind of misrepresenting God. Then the woman asked, whom shall I bring up for you? Bring up Samuel, he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried at the top of her voice, and she said to Saul, "Ah." And the king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a ghostly figure coming up out of the earth." "What does he look like?" he asked. "And wearing a robe is coming up," she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and he prostrated himself with his face to the ground. I think things that is amazing to me is it shocked her. She's as surprised and frightened when she cries out at the top of her voice. It worked. And because of it being such a deceptive thing that, communicating with the dead. And even today, do we not have Ouija boards? I hear people all the time talking about, Ouija boards and I'm sorry, that thing scares me. It scared me as a kid when I heard some guys talking about it, how you take this board and you put this thing on it and you ask it a question out, and I thought, I don't know, there's just something about it that was just not right from when I was very little. So you want to bring up somebody from the dead? And then it worked. So she somehow now knows that this is Saul as well. She knows who he is and feels like that she's been deceived. And he says, no, just tell me, what do you see? And she sees him coming up and describes him to a T. And Saul understood. He knew by the description right away. He said, that is Samuel. So he prostrates himself in a form of respect. And so Samuel, though, look at Samuel's response in verse 15. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy, predicted through me? The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." So that's what one of the other things we see a lot of, and I thought of Jeremiah. Whenever the people had come to Jeremiah after the city had been destroyed and everybody had been led off into captivity, a governor had been left in place to manage by the order of Nebuchadnezzar. They end up, some zealots kill the governor of Nebuchadnezzar, and the people that are left there are panicky. They don't know what to do. They go to Jeremiah and they tell Jeremiah, "Oh, Jeremiah, please consult with God. Please tell us what to do. And whatever you say," which, if you'll recall, everything he said before, they never listened to. Whenever the king asked him, "We're being besieged, Jeremiah, what should we do?" He said, "Open up the gates and it'll go better for you." What'd they do? They beat him and they throw him back into a well. Now, they rebelled again. "Oh, Jeremiah," and this is what I hear people all the time, "Oh, Lord, tell me what to do. Whatever you tell me to do, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I promise, I swear, whatever it is, no matter if we like it or not." And this is what you find. A person who is not with God is going to grasp. They grasp at everything they can. There's a reason God wasn't talking to him, and he knew it. He hadn't forgot. That's why he's trying to kill David. He knows his transgressions. How could he forget that conversation that he had last with Samuel, when Samuel told him that the kingdom was going to be ripped away from him? And so the irony is, the word was the same. It didn't change at all. "So why'd you bring me up?" "Well, I'm in great distress, and I've got this situation. The Philistines are armored up, and we're going to go to war, and I'm really afraid, and God's not talking to me, and so I called on you." So wait a minute. You're not with God. I'm with God. What makes you think all of a sudden you're going to get a better message from me than what God's not talking to you? And that's what I get that sometimes. You know, people will read their Bibles and they read the same word that I'm reading, but they'll turn to me and they'll say, tell me what that's saying. You know, it's like they're wanting to hear something that is a little different, or maybe they're not understanding the way that the word is written, which is very clear. And they're wanting a different answer. And then when they get the answer that they really should have listened to the first time, they can't handle it. So he says, well, you know, there's a reason. So why do you consult with me? You know the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy. That to me is frightening. To imagine that not only has God departed him, but God has become his enemy. You know, if we're not with God, we're against him. It's that clear. I think that's another part where people don't grasp sometimes, is that you don't get to pick and choose. And when it's convenient for you, like it is with Saul right now, he all of a sudden decides, you know, well, I want to get advice from God. But he's not wanting to repent. Have you heard anything of him saying about repentance? Even with Samuel, when he started crying and pulling on his garments, that wasn't repenting. That was like the kid that was crying because he got caught taking cookies out of the cookie jar. Not the fact that he was taking them and it was wrong. It's because he got caught. And the same mature, selfish attitude that Saul has continually shown time and time again. And so he tells him it's exactly what the Lord had predicted. You're just seeing the fulfillment of exactly what the Lord has said through me. And so now the kingdom is going to be ripped. And then he gives him more detail, doesn't he? He says that not only that, but he says you're going to watch the brutality. And it's because of what you did. You did not, and this is something interesting. Look at what he says in 18. You wrath against the Amalekites. And that wasn't random. I think we need to remember the history of why God had such fierce wrath against them. And it was because, like I said earlier, about the way they treated the vulnerable of the Israelites as they were coming out of Egypt. They didn't attack the strong part of the caravan. They went after the stragglers, those who were weak and falling behind. And so it was something that God was fulfilling. And because you disobeyed that. So now, a part of this, and this was not something that just came up, this is a part of what was going to happen whether he consulted with Samuel or not. But that the Philistines, he says, you and your sons are going to be with me. What is he saying? Well, I'm dead. So you and your sons. The consequences is another sad part of this man's unrighteousness, of selfishness, of not realizing that his lack of spirituality is also causing the death of his own children. And especially we know one, Jonathan, who David and Jonathan were so close and loving each other as close as any friend could be. And not only are you going to lose your life and your sons, but the army is going to be destroyed. So what does that mean when the Israelites lose their army? They're done. There's nothing left to protect God's people. So, yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and pause there and give a chance to talk about it. So what are your thoughts? I get to doing like you were talking about. You get talking and then you don't stop. Let some people. And that's a habit because all I do is I look up at this little camera in the back. And so a lot of times I just get going and don't slow down. So I'm going to ask the first thing is, what do you think about David making the decision to go to the land of the Philistines? Kind of drives me crazy. We got like a 16-second lag, so I have to really kind of wait. So if anybody So Becky says either you're with God or you're not. And that's right when we talk about, trying to pick and choose your times, is wait on the Lord. And when we talk about wait on the Lord, as far as like the way David, he may have been a little bit impatient trying to protect everybody. I don't know that it was necessarily the best decision that he could have made when it comes to that. So what do you think about his deception, the way he was telling Achish what he was doing versus what he was really doing? Dorothy says, I think David was tired of being chased by Saul, so he figured he would go to the Philistines and they would fight his fight for him. Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's a good point. It has to wear on you. I mean, we know that there's at least, being conservative, 5 years that he's been on the run. And no matter where he goes, Saul seems to be able to catch up with him. And how many more times can he not kill the king? How much longer and still protect? And even if he was to engage in a battle, remember the numbers. Saul is coming the last time with 3,000 men. And it says choice men too. So these weren't just your average warriors. These were men who were capable of fighting. And if you look at warfare back in that day and age, you look at the death rate in an engagement. By the time you have that many engaging in battle, 600 men against 3,000, all it's just is a matter of time. And eventually those 600 are going to fall at the rate of the casualty rate in an engagement hand to hand, the way they would fight. He would still suffer a tremendous loss. So Becky says, lying is never the way to go. You usually will be found out. Yeah, David is being very deceptive. And again, this is not something that God is necessarily endorsing, that you should lie. But in an interesting way, one of the things that he was doing by attacking these other clans or tribes were attacking enemies of Israel. And it's kind of, when you look further down, when he becomes, David is able to accomplish that really no other king was ever able to accomplish, was peace, by completely destroying and dismantling all of his enemies around him. He handed off a kingdom to Solomon. Solomon never had to war. Solomon, matter of fact, the expansion, if you look at a map and you look at the original kingdom that David off to Solomon, Solomon extended up north a ways, but Solomon never had to fight. And I think one of the things that I picked up on was looking at these raids that he was going on while he was living among the Philistines, was, I think, exacting a judgment like what Samuel said that God had wanted against the Amalekites, as well as these others that were enemies. So yeah, it's hard to necessarily say the straight up line, but then again, he is still accomplishing things for the Lord and attacking the enemies and the unrighteous. So what do you think about the statement that David says when he says, yeah, and you're going to get to see what I can do? When King Achish says, okay, David, you're going to have to come with me. And you're going to have to prove yourself, basically. Okay, I get it. I trust you. You've been out there killing Israelites, and you've been coming back and giving me some of it. You're sharing. You're not holding back from me. But now you're going to have to show up with and fight alongside of these other Philistines against God's people. And I think that was a very interesting choice of words that David said, that, yeah, yes, you're going to finally get to see what I can do. And David was shrewd. So Becky says, David knew the Lord was with him and make him successful. And I think that's something that, in trusting in the Lord, his choice of words was was demonstrating. That's why I feel, knowing that he was not going to kill the king, he had opportunities to kill the king, that even if he went with the Amalekites, and because he doesn't, and it's kind of spoiler alert for next week, that he doesn't go for other reasons, but that he was not going to, he was going to allow himself to remain true to protecting the king's anointed, which meant that he would turn on them, which is going to set up next week when we look at the conflict between the Philistine king and his own commanders and what they're going to say about David. And they're actually right. They're dead on because they do not trust David. They look at the king. The king is angry with them for challenging him because he says, I trust David. David's going to go with us. The commanders go, They're angry back. They sound up and they go, wait a minute. This is the guy they wrote a song about. How many thousands of Philistines and what's going to happen. And they saw it coming. They even say, look, when we get into the battle, he's going to turn on us. And so that's going to cause Achish to actually end up sending him back. Well, any other closing comments or thoughts or? Well, we got a really good-sized class online, and it's really good to see all the only thing I wish I need to try to figure out how to do technically is to be able to put the chat up on the screen for people that are in here so everyone can see the comments as well. But it's very encouraging. I really appreciate your time and your input. And like I said, I'm learning how to do all this stuff at the same time. So I appreciate your time with us, and we'll see you guys, Lord willing, this coming